hey, I actually am kind of kinky. We haven't really done this, but I wanted to share that side of myself with you. What if I were tied up and you could do anything you wanted to me?
Our question today comes from Victoria, who's been dating her new boyfriend for several months now. She describes him as a gentle and sweet soul, and she loves that about him, but reports that she has a very kinky past and is afraid to bring up her kinks with him for fear of scaring him away with her crazy fantasies. She's enjoying what she describes as a calm and normal relationship and is questioning herself on wanting to drag him into BDSM when so much of the relationship is working well. This is the first time that she's felt that she's in a peaceful relationship, whereas her BDSM partnerships in the past were a lot more tumultuous.
Let's jump into this. One of the interesting challenges is that BDSM is more intimate. BDSM is fundamentally playing with deeper and crazier and more chaotic forces down in our unconscious, down in our deeper depths. It is not calm, and relationships that engage in it will be, to a significant degree, less calm. The problem is that often people who become aware that they have these desires do not also develop a superordinate ability to engage in the calmer aspects of a relationship to provide relief from the intensity of BDSM play. And so I've been guilty of that in my life, where it is extremely intense, incredibly passionate, and fundamentally falls apart because it's just so much, right? Now, here she's gotten relief, not from a partner who has learned to also be calm at different times, but by finding a different partner, by breaking off a relationship, now finding a calm partner, but realizes that she's missing the intensity and depth. Yes, you need security, comfort, relaxation, rest, safety, all of those things. You also need depth and intimacy and passion and connection and eroticism. And there is a tension between those things. And so, yes, she's now feeling pulled to take the calm guy and pull him into a more intimate space. Now, I would say that it is possible that he also would enjoy that. And so hopefully, and we can talk about how, hopefully she will open up and tell him about her kinky desires, and they can explore that world together, knowing that they've built that security already and can kind of return to it at times as well. So I think that there's opportunity here, which is hopeful. From her description, she describes her BDSM relationships as crazy in themselves. It sounds like the relationship was a bit toxic as well. And again, when you're playing with these forces and people aren't thinking deeply or linking them to a morality or linking them to an ethic or a value or a philosophical structure, then they can get pretty toxic because these unconscious impulses are not super pretty. And so, yeah, the person has to have a certain level of personal development in order for the intensity and depth of BDSM experiences to be contained in a safe container, which it sounds like it was not. And so I think I'm glad for her. I think she's enjoying a relationship that isn't harmful or toxic, it sounds like. It sounds like it's loving, and she's enjoying that as she should. It doesn't mean that there's anything fundamentally opposed to engaging in BDSM. In fact, this may be her best opportunity to engage with it, but she just has to find a way to broach that wall and start exploring.
One of the threads that I picked up on the question over here is with respect to the past relationships, which she says were very tumultuous. Now, in my own experience, there have been times where I've dated someone who is what I would call, for lack of a better word, hypersexual. They were very sexual all the time. They were definitely kinky. And it never worked out because they were also not very emotionally stable. And this is where kind of a BDSM gets a bad rap, because the idea is that, well, if you're doing all these things, you just must be a very weird, hypersexual person with no regard for social mores and all of that other stuff. But it just could be that those people are just all shadow and no persona. They haven't really figured out a way to integrate their shadow with their persona. They're just all Mr. Hyde, and there's no Dr. Jekyll in their personalities. And so they're fundamentally unstable, because then they're also shadow-like in all other domains. They can't have a normal conversation when there's a conflict. They can't do conflict resolution in a calm sort of way. Everything is just ramped up to 100 in all domains of life, because they're just shadow all the time. They're just They're just that dark side of them, which is, them is your dark shadow side, and it can be expressed in a healthy way, in a consensual relationship when you're doing. But a lot of people, I think, kind of feel like it's just, well, this is dark person, right? And there was this really interesting series that came out. I think it was on Hulu or something. And it was about this couple. I think it's called Normal People. And it's very engaging. The guy is a sweet person and she's a great girl, and they just can't seem to get together. They just keep getting in their own way, and then they get together and then they break up, and they get together, they break up. And you as an audience member is like, for fuck's sakes, can't you just have a normal conversation and just get it over with? And in one of their cycles where they had broken up and they were living far apart, she's depicted as getting into BDSM. And so they showed scenes of her where she was spanked and like used and all that other stuff. But what the show writers, or at least those scenes, were communicating is like, well, she's just in a really dark place right now. And that is why she's into all this BDSM stuff, because she's so damaged, right? She's just hurting so much that she just wants to be used and abused. And the inherent implication of showing those scenes, well, this is what an unstable person does. Right. And even in the cultural context of our times, people who are engaging in BDSM, there's some subliminal sense of, well, they're not very stable people. And that's kind of what's coming across in her own perception of BDSM. She's like, well, my past relationships were a lot more tumultuous. And that's because maybe she just really was dealing with people who were not well integrated, who weren't able to express their shadow in a way that was healthy, and then turn off that shadow when conflict arose so they could have a calm conversation about what went wrong.
I think one of the things you're pointing at there is that healthy BDSM requires multiple skills. It's not just one. One skill is the ability to open up and dive into your shadow and to admit that you have these desires, that these things do turn you on, that you have lust and rage and greed and you have a huge sex drive and all these things. But the second step is integration. We've talked in other episodes about not just going to camp out and live in the shadow, right? That's not the goal either. The goal is to, yes, go into the shadow and then return. It's a journey and return. The spiritual language that's usually most evocative is pilgrimage. And each of these episodes of BDSM, you might say, is a pilgrimage into your shadow. But if you don't come back, it's not a pilgrimage. You're just
It's
an exile.
migration.
Yeah, exactly. And so you do have to develop the container of yourself to be big enough to contain the parts of the shadow that you unearth. And some significant part of that is emotional regulation. Is you're going to dig up some big emotions. Are you able to regulate big emotions? Or the moment you get a big emotion, you get overwhelmed and act out and go crazy? And if you don't have emotional regulation down, you better not be digging around finding your biggest emotions, no matter how good they feel. And so there are these skills that are important. Morality is another one. Is having a moral code, having something you adhere to rigorously to keep you straight, so that as you dive into these unconscious desires in a consensual and loving way and in a healthy way, you have a touchstone of how far you will go and how far you won't go. And no matter how enjoyable it is, you will not traverse your moral boundaries. That's the container. You're not going to ignore a safe word. You're not going to harm someone permanently. These kinds of, and for me, one of my big moral limits here is I will not engage in play that leaves my partner worse off than they were. And so that's an important framing for me personally, morally. And that helps me as a touchstone is, hey, when I'm humiliating my partner, am I doing it in a way that has secret praise underneath it? Am I saying, hey, it's amazing that you trust me enough to be this slutty with me? That's a very different saying, right? You don't have to say the whole thing every time, but if that's the underlying tone, it will be felt and received rather than, ugh, gross, you're such a slut. Mm-hmm. Right? That tone is, for me, further than I'm comfortable going for sure, because I do not want the other person ever questioning what was real. And so that's a big part of my play is framing the integration ahead of time as we're engaging in the play. I know how this is being integrated for both of us because, yes, we're going into the shadows, but we're going in with the intention of coming back. And this is how we're going to come back is I'm not going to go in and break you down and then leave you wondering if that was the truth or really what I thought or whatever. No, it's going to be reintegrated. And that's a part of the journey back is a part of the journey there because I know how I'm coming back. It's already planned. It's already framed, right? At least on a moral and psychological structure. Anyway, I do think it's worth mentioning briefly the notion to answer her question because she asked, how shall I tell my boyfriend here? And I think especially with someone shy or maybe inexperienced, framing previous experience can be intimidating or challenging. So I think that may not be her best bet. I think that one of the better ways is, as something you've pointed out before, is to own the label and to say, hey, I actually am kind of kinky. We haven't really done this, but I wanted to share that side of myself with you. Frame it as an intimacy, which it is. That's a correct, truthful framing, but it's also a very helpful framing. And I wonder if we could talk about some fantasies. And then I find taking one of the tests to be very useful to explore a checklist. Like the one I prefer is kinkslist.com, Kinx list.com. And the reason I prefer that one on some level is that it's very extensive and it has pretty extreme ones on there. So it's a lot easier to admit you might want to spank a girl when you've said no to cutting her or branding her. Like, oh no, I don't want to, that's crazy. Ha 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 ha. Oh, but maybe I would like to spank you. Okay, that's a bit easier to frame because now I've said no to one thing that seemed extreme, quote unquote. So I find that to be a useful aspect. And then, as I always recommend with any of these lists, is to go through them and tell mini fantasies to the person who's less into it. Well, what if I were tied up and you could do anything you wanted to me? What would you do? And what would I want you to do? What would be hot? What do I think it would be hot if you did? Well, I think it would be hot if you really teased me but didn't let me come. Whoa, why? And then again, why? Why would that be hot? What would you experience? And to get his mind going in this direction, which may be a new direction, but I think some specific stories and examples help to go through a list of like, even, oh yeah, I think if you used a butt plug on me, that would make me feel really owned and it would make me feel really submissive, just the penetration, whatever the thing is, talk about it, fantasize about it, explain the fantasy. Maybe I should clarify. So talk about the fantasy, express the fantasy, fantasize together, and then explain the fantasy and say, this is what I would feel. This is what would be hot. What do you think about that? And it's a very long negotiation process, but I think it's a great way of introducing some of these concepts, even without a list. Just pick a couple of common ones: bondage, spanking, teasing, force, roughness, hair pulling. These are all kinks on some level, but they're super common. And I think just expressing the desire for some of that and fantasizing about it could give him space to try it out and walk into the shallow end.